5 disturbing winter horror stories from the jungles of Andhra Pradesh. Story 1. Shadows of the Mangrove Forest. The small village of Janavaram, nestled deep in the mangrove forests of Andhra Pradesh, seemed timeless. In January, a thick fog blanketed the village, amplifying the eerie silence that hung in the air. Villagers whispered tales of the Chaya rat, a night when the shadows came alive, claiming those who dared venture into the forest after sundown. Amara, a young anthropology student from Hyderabad, arrived in the village with her mentor, Dr. Ravi. They were here to study the folklore of the Mangrove region for a research paper. Despite warnings from the locals, their curiosity pushed them to delve into the stories that shrouded the forest in fear. The villagers spoke of an ancient temple hidden deep within the mangroves, a place cursed by a forgotten deity. Amara and Dr. Ravi decided to investigate, accompanied by a local guide, Venu. The path was narrow and winding, with roots and branches forming natural obstacles. As they ventured deeper, the sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, and an unsettling stillness took over. Venu, usually cheerful, became uncharacteristically quiet. "We should turn back before dark," he warned, his voice trembling. Amara dismissed his fears as superstition, but Dr. Ravi noticed the unease in Venu's eyes. "Let's not push too far," he suggested, though curiosity kept him moving forward. As dusk approached, the trio stumbled upon the ruins of the ancient temple. The structure was crumbling, overtaken by roots and vines. Inside, they found carvings depicting a shadowy figure with elongated limbs and glowing eyes, the deity known as Kalakiran. According to legend, Kalakiran punished those who disrespected the balance of nature. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, and a chilling wind swept through the temple. Whispers, faint but distinct, echoed around them. "Leave, before it's too late," they seemed to say. Venu panicked and bolted, leaving Amara and Dr. Ravi behind. As they turned to follow him, they realized the forest path had vanished, replaced by an endless maze of mangroves. Trapped in the forest, Amara and Dr. Ravi began to experience strange occurrences. Shadows moved independently of any light source, and the whispers grew louder, forming words in a language neither could understand. Amara felt an invisible presence following them, its gaze heavy and oppressive. Exhausted and terrified, they stumbled upon a clearing where they found Venu, trembling and incoherent. "It's watching us," he muttered repeatedly. Before they could calm him, a dark figure emerged from the trees. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its elongated limbs moved unnaturally. The trio froze as the creature's guttural growl reverberated through the clearing. Summoning their courage, Amara and Dr. Ravi grabbed Venu and ran. The creature pursued them, its movements unervingly fast and fluid. The forest seemed to conspire against them, roots tripping them and branches clawing at their clothes. Just when they thought they were doomed, they saw the faint lights of the village. Bursting out of the forest, they collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. The villagers rushed to their aid, but their relief was short-lived. Venu's shadow moved on its own, and his eyes turned milky white. Before their horrified eyes, he was consumed by darkness, leaving behind only his screams. The villagers performed rituals to cleanse Amara and Dr. Ravi, but they could never forget the horrors they had witnessed. The forest remained as mysterious and menacing as ever, a place where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural blurred. Amara vowed to document their experience, not as a warning, but as a reminder of the power of the unknown. To this day, the villagers of Janavaram avoid the forest at night, and the legend of Kalakiran continues to haunt their dreams, a chilling reminder that some shadows are best left undisturbed. Thank you for joining us on this terrifying journey into the shadows of Andhra Pradesh. Story 2. The Wailing Trees of Dandeli. The moon hung high over the dense canopy of trees, casting a silver hue over the forest floor. The air was thick with fog, and the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves. Irvin stood on the edge of the forest, his camera ready, his heart pounding with anticipation. His thirst for adventure had led him to Dandeli, a place whispered about in every corner of the state. The locals spoke of the wailing trees, an unnatural phenomenon that only occurred during the early months of the year. His fingers tightened around the camera. He had heard the rumors. People who ventured too deep into the forest were never seen again. The trees themselves seemed to weep in the dead of night, and strange shapes had been seen moving in the fog. As he stepped forward, the fog thickened, and the air grew heavy, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The trees seemed to bend toward him, their twisted branches clawing at the air. Ervin's eyes narrowed as he walked deeper into the forest. This was where the disappearances had happened. This was where the answers lay. Suddenly, a sound cut through the silence. It was a wail, deep and mournful, echoing through the trees. Ervin froze, his heart racing. It was unlike any animal sound he had ever heard. A voice, human and animal in equal measure. It sent a shiver down his spine. Just a trick of the wind? Ervin muttered to himself, but the wail came again, louder this time. Ervin had arrived in Dandeli to uncover the truth. The villagers had long since ceased to speak openly about the forest, but it was clear from their eyes that something was wrong. They told him stories of the old village that once stood at the edge of the forest, an abandoned settlement, long since forgotten, where strange things were said to happen. "Don't go into the forest after dark," the village elder had warned him. "It's cursed, and the wails you hear are the souls of the lost ones. You won't find your way out." Ervin, however, had never been one to heed warnings. The thrill of discovering the unknown was too great, and the stories only fueled his desire to uncover the truth. That evening, he set up camp near a clearing in the forest. The air was colder than usual, and the wind seemed to carry something. A whisper perhaps, or just his imagination. But as night fell, the wails returned, this time closer, as though they were following him. "Just the wind," Ervin repeated, but the voice in the back of his head told him otherwise. As he ventured further into the forest the next day, he began to notice strange markings on the trees. They were carved into the bark, deep and purposeful. Some were shapes he couldn't understand, others resembled faces twisted in agony. And there, at the base of one of the trees, was a faded relic, an old, cracked idol, its eyes hollow and blackened with age. His camera snapped a photo of the idol, and that was when he heard it. The wail, louder and clearer than before, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the forest. Someone or something was watching him. The trembling grew stronger, and Ervin's feet slipped from beneath him. He fell to the ground, his camera crashing into the earth beside him. The figures loomed over him, their faces still twisted in anguish, but now there was something more in their eyes, something darker, something older. As Ervin struggled to his feet, the air around him grew colder. The wails reached a fever pitch, and the trees around him began to groan and creak, their branches swaying unnaturally. It was as if the forest itself was alive, reacting to the disturbance. With a sudden, violent crack, one of the figures lunged toward him, its arms reaching out like twisted branches. Ervin barely managed to dodge its grasp, his heart racing in his chest. He had to get out, but no matter which direction he turned, the forest seemed to close in on him. And then the ground beneath him gave way. Ervin screamed as he fell into the earth, the darkness swallowing him whole. When Ervin awoke, he found himself in a place he didn't recognize. A vast, underground cavern, its walls covered in strange, glowing symbols. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the wails had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. As he stumbled to his feet, he saw them, the wailing souls of the forest. They were trapped, their spirits bound to the trees, cursed to walk the earth for all eternity. And at the center of the cavern stood the source of the curse, the ancient spirit of the forest. It was a massive, twisted form, its body made of roots, branches, and bone, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "You have entered my domain," the spirit boomed, its voice shaking the very ground beneath him. "And now you will join the others." The cavern was vast, its ceilings hidden in darkness, and the walls shimmered with eerie symbols etched deep into the stone. Ervin stumbled across the uneven ground, his mind racing to understand the force that held him in this strange, oppressive place. The The silence in the cavern was suffocating, broken only by the soft murmurs of forgotten voices that seemed to come from nowhere. The spirit, massive and terrifying, towered above him, its form twisting like a tree in a storm. Its roots seemed to burrow deep into the earth, and its body was composed of gnarled branches, vines, and bones that creaked with age. It seemed to pulsate with life, as if every inch of it was alive, an ancient being whose very presence bent reality. "You are not the first to stumble into my domain," the spirit intoned, its voice shaking the cavern. "Nor will you be the last. This forest has claimed many souls before you, and it will claim many more. You are in the heart of the Dandeli forest, the very essence of its curse." Arvind shuddered, his eyes wide as he tried to make sense of the spirit's words. "I was once a protector of this land," the spirit continued. "Long ago, I was a guardian, a spirit bound to the forest, ensuring its balance. But greed led the people to destroy the sacred places. They desecrated the land, cutting down trees, taking more than they needed, disturbing the peace of nature. In their pursuit of wealth, they awakened something older, something darker than they could ever imagine." The spirit's glowing eyes flickered with sorrow and rage. "They unleashed the curse. It was not I who brought it upon them, but the anger of the earth itself." The spirit of the forest turned vengeful. It was not only a curse for the people of the village, but a punishment that spread throughout the land. "The wails you hear are the cries of those who dared to disturb the sacred bond between man and nature. They, too, are trapped, bound to the forest as I am." Arvind felt the ground tremble as the spirit's form twisted in anger. "The trees you see, the wailing that fills the night, they are the souls of those who have been caught. Their sins, their greed, they could not escape. And neither can you." Arvind tried to step back, but the roots of the ancient tree spirit lashed out, coiling around his legs and lifting him into the air. His heart raced as the spirit's words pierced his mind like daggers. "Do you understand, Arvind? Do you understand what has happened here?" The spirit's voice grew more frantic, its rage seeping into the air around them. "These souls are trapped by their own choices, their own arrogance. The trees, the wails, the fog, these are manifestations of their anguish. Each tree is a prison, each wail a cry for release, and there is no release for them." Arvind could barely breathe as the spirit's presence overwhelmed him. He gasped for air, his mind reeling from the implications of the curse. The spirit's wrath had not only cursed the villagers, but had also trapped its own protector in eternal torment. "The wailing trees," the spirit murmured, its voice distant, "are the physical manifestations of the souls who walked this forest with greed in their hearts. With every passing year, the wails grow louder as more souls become bound to this cursed place. The trees, my trees, cry out, calling for redemption, for release, but no one can hear them." The fog outside thickened, rolling over the forest like a wave. Arvind could see the faint outlines of figures in the mist, twisted and malformed, their faces contorted in silent agony. They were the souls, the lost ones, the doomed souls of the villagers and those who had come before them. Their forms drifted through the trees like whispers, their eyes vacant and hollow, lost to the curse that had claimed them. "Why do they suffer?" Arvind asked, his voice trembling. "Why does this curse exist?" The spirit let out a long, mournful sigh. "The forest was once a sacred place, a place of peace between man and nature. We existed in harmony, but the greed of man disturbed the delicate balance. When the people of the village chose to desecrate the sacred grounds, they awoke a wrath that could not be contained. They paid with their lives, but the curse did not end with them. The land itself became twisted, and it called for more souls. The trees became its vessels, the fog its mask, and the wails its song." Arvind felt the weight of the spirit's words settle over him. He had come to the forest seeking adventure, unaware of the long, tragic history hidden beneath its roots. The trees he had seen earlier were not just trees. They were prisons, each one holding a soul bound by the sins of the past. As the spirit's words echoed in his mind, Arvind felt something stir deep within the forest. The ground beneath him trembled again, this time more violently. The wails grew louder, and he felt the trees pressing closer around him, their branches clawing at the air, as if reaching for him. The wails grew louder still, a cacophony of tortured voices crying out for release. Ervind felt his chest tighten as the realization hit him. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of this curse now. The trees were closing in, and the roots were pulling him toward the center of the cavern, where the ancient spirit stood. The pact that was made long ago, the spirit continued, was not one of choice. The villagers sought wealth, and in their greed, they disturbed the forest's spirit. In return for their crimes, they became part of the forest itself. Their bodies were lost, but their souls remained, trapped in the trees. As long as the forest exists, so will they. Ervind felt a surge of dread as he looked around at the shifting forms, the wailing souls who seemed to reach out to him. He could feel their pain, their hunger for release. They weren't just victims, they were the cursed. And now, he too was being drawn into the same fate. Can it be stopped? Ervind asked, his voice barely a whisper. Is there any way to end this curse? The spirit was silent for a moment, as though considering the question. There is a way, it said finally, but it comes at a great cost. The spirit of the forest must be freed. To do so, the blood of one who is tied to the land must be offered as a sacrifice. Only then can the curse be broken. Ervind's mind raced. A sacrifice? Was he being asked to offer his own life, his own blood, to end the torment that had consumed this place for so long? The weight of the decision pressed heavily upon him. But then, something deep within him stirred. The image of the old village, the faces of the lost villagers, and the agony of the wailing souls flashed before his eyes. The curse had to end. The spirits had to be freed. I will do it, Ervind said, his voice firm. I will break the curse. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble in approval. The spirit's presence grew stronger, its form taking on a more solid shape as the air around them crackled with energy. The time had come. Ervind could feel the eyes of the lost souls upon him, their voices rising in unison as if calling to him, pleading with him to end their suffering. The wails crescendoed, filling the cavern with a sound so intense, so full of sorrow, that it threatened to shatter his mind. With a deep breath, Ervind stepped forward. The forest seemed to part before him, the trees swaying as if guiding him toward the heart of the cavern. He could see the spirit of the forest waiting, its ancient, gnarled roots stretching out like arms, ready to receive him. The wails reached their peak, and Ervind's pulse quickened. He knew what he had to do. The blood of one tied to the land, he was that person. The forest had chosen him as its vessel for the final release. As the final wail echoed through the trees, Ervind knelt before the spirit, offering himself to the forest. The ground trembled once more, and the curse of Dandeli was broken. Years passed since Ervind's sacrifice. The forest of Dandeli, once a place of torment, had begun to heal. The cursed wailing that had echoed through the trees was now a distant memory, and the fog that had hung thickly over the land was no longer a sign of dread. The villagers, who had long lived in fear, had returned to the edge of the forest, rebuilding their homes and lives. But even in this newfound peace, there was an unspoken understanding. The forest was not entirely free. The memories of its dark past still lingered in the whispers of the wind, and the trees, though no longer wailing, carried a heavy silence. One evening in early January, when the fog crept back into the forest like a forgotten shadow, a young man named Vikram arrived in the village. He had heard the stories of the haunted forest, of the ancient spirit, and of the sacrifice made to break the curse. But Vikram was not like other men. He was a scholar, a historian, drawn to the mysteries of the land. And Dandeli's story was one he could not ignore. He walked alone, his boots crunching over the leaves as he ventured into the forest, his mind set on uncovering the truth. The villagers had warned him, but Vikram was resolute. He had to understand what had really happened, what had truly broken the curse, and how it had affected the very soul of the land. As he stepped deeper into the forest, the air grew heavier. The trees, now silent, seemed to watch him, their twisted limbs swaying with the faintest breeze. The fog curled around his ankles, just as it had done for those who had come before him. Vikram paused. There was something here, something he couldn't quite explain. A sense of unease, like an ancient force was stirring once more. And then he heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. But it was not. It was a voice filled with sorrow and longing, so faint that it almost seemed like a memory from a time long past. "Arvind," the whisper called. "Arvind, you are not forgotten." Vikram's breath caught in his throat as the wind picked up, swirling around him like a dance. He turned quickly, scanning the trees, but there was nothing except the dense fog and the rustling leaves. His mind raced. Could the stories be true? Could Arvind's sacrifice have truly ended the curse? Or had something been left behind? Something that had not yet been appeased? As Vikram moved further into the heart of the forest, a chill ran down his spine. The whispers grew louder, clearer. They were no longer just voices on the wind. They were the wails of the lost souls, the echo of Arvind's sacrifice, reverberating through the very fabric of the forest. The trees seemed to move closer, their gnarled branches reaching out like hands, trying to touch him. The ground beneath his feet pulsed with energy, as though the earth itself was remembering the curse, remembering the ancient pact that had bound so many souls to this place. And then, as if materializing from the mist itself, a figure appeared before him. It was Arvind, or at least it looked like him. The figure stood tall, his form blurry and indistinct, like a shadow caught between worlds. His eyes glowed faintly with a pale light, a reflection of the sorrow that had consumed him. "Why do you return?" the figure of Arvind asked, his voice echoing with both sadness and strength. "The curse is broken. You should leave this place." Vikram could barely speak, his voice caught in his throat. I came to understand, to learn what truly happened here." Arvind's form wavered, and for a moment, Vikram thought he saw the figure smile, though it was tinged with a deep sadness. "The forest remembers," Arvind said quietly. "The curse was lifted, yes, but the forest is still alive. It holds the memories of those it claimed, and the land never forgets." Vikram felt a cold weight settle in his chest, a realization that perhaps no one, not even Arvind, could truly escape the forest's grip. It had been broken, but the forest's heart, the wailing trees, the ancient spirit, would forever remain in the land's bloodline, part of its soul. "You may walk away," Arvind's spirit murmured, "but the forest will always call. It will always remember." With those final words, the figure began to fade into the mist, leaving behind only the sound of the wind in the trees, the soft whisper of Arvind's voice still echoing in Vikram's mind. Vikram stood in the eerie silence, the weight of what he had just witnessed pressing on him. He had come seeking knowledge, but he had discovered something far deeper, a reminder that the past was never truly gone. It lingered in the fog, in the trees, and in the whispers of the lost. As he turned to leave, the mist swirled around him once more. The trees seemed to bow, their branches creaking as if in acknowledgement of his departure. But in the distance, just beyond the fog, Vikram swore he heard something. A faint, mournful wail that echoed through the forest, soft yet unmistakable. And for the first time, Vikram understood. The forest of Dandeli was not just a place. It was a living thing, a place of memory and loss, a land where the past never fully released its grip. The wailing trees, though silenced, would always carry the echoes of the souls trapped within. And so, the forest waited in silence, in peace, and in the knowledge that it would never truly let go. Story 3. The Whispering Shadows of Andhra Pradesh. It was the early days of January, when the cold mist settled over the sleepy village of Galapalli, nestled in the rolling hills of Andhra Pradesh. Rajesh, a young man in his late 20s, had returned to his ancestral home after many years. He had lived in the bustling cities for most of his adult life, but the news of his grandmother's declining health had brought him back to his roots. Galapalli was a village like many others, with narrow, dirt-packed roads that wound through dense groves of trees. The houses were made of clay and thatch, their thatched roofs weathered by the years, but sturdy enough to withstand the seasonal rains. The air always smelled faintly of earth and incense, and the distant call of birds echoed through the trees. But something was different this time. The locals spoke little, their faces etched with worry as Rajesh walked through the village. The villagers were reserved, with their eyes glancing nervously at the dense forest that bordered the settlement. It was as though an unspoken fear hung in the air, like a dense fog. Grandmother Nirmala, still sharp despite her years, welcomed Rajesh with a warm smile. But even she seemed uneasy, as though there was something she wasn't telling him. "Rajesh," she said, her voice trembling, "you're back after so many years, but I must warn you about the forest. It's not like it used to be. The whispers, they are stronger now." "What whispers, grandmother?" Rajesh asked, laughing lightly. "It's just the wind, surely." "No," she insisted, her expression darkening. "It's not the wind. The forest speaks, and sometimes it listens." Later that evening, Rajesh sat by the fire in the small living room, watching his grandmother stir the pot of stew. The flames flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The village seemed eerily quiet. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. As the wind howled outside, Rajesh's curiosity grew. He had heard strange rumors from the villagers about the ancient well in the forest, the one hidden deep within the trees. Some claimed it was cursed. Others said that the well was the source of the whispers that haunted the village. But no one dared to speak openly about it. There was an air of secrecy, as if something had been forgotten but never truly laid to rest. "Grandmother," Rajesh asked cautiously, "what do you know about the well in the forest?" Nirmala paused, her hands trembling. Her eyes, though aged, were sharp with wisdom. She stared at Rajesh for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Later that evening, Rajesh sat by the fire in the small living room, watching his grandmother stir the pot of stew. The flames flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The village seemed eerily quiet. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. As the wind howled outside, Rajesh's curiosity grew. He had heard strange rumors from the villagers about the ancient well in the forest, the one hidden deep within the trees. Some claimed it was cursed. Others said that the well was the source of the whispers that haunted the village. But no one dared to speak openly about it. There was an air of secrecy, as if something had been forgotten but never truly laid to rest. "Grandmother," Rajesh asked cautiously, "what do you know about the well in the forest?" Nirmala paused, her hands trembling. Her eyes, though aged, were sharp with wisdom. She stared at Rajesh for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. "The well is where it all began," she said softly. "But it is best not to speak of it. There are forces at work that we cannot understand. Forces that have been sealed away, but are always waiting for someone to stir them." Rajesh felt a chill run down his spine. He could tell that this was more than just a local superstition. There was a darkness in his grandmother's voice, a fear that had been passed down through the generations. The next morning, Rajesh ventured into the village to speak with the local priest. The man, clad in simple robes, was known to be deeply connected with the ancient spiritual traditions of the region. Father Madhava, the priest, greeted Rajesh with a solemn nod.
"Ah, Rajesh.
I've heard you've come back. I hope your grandmother is doing well." "She's fine," Rajesh replied, "but I need to ask you about something. The well in the forest. Do you know anything about it?" Father Madhava's expression darkened. He glanced around as though to ensure no one was listening before he spoke. "The well," he began, his voice low, "is not just any well. It is an ancient site of worship, abandoned long ago. But it was once a place where dark rituals were performed. The spirit that guards it. She was a priestess, betrayed by those she trusted. Her anger is bound to the land, to the forest itself. Her name was Chandrika." "Chandrika?" Rajesh asked, confused. "But why would a spirit haunt the land? What does she want?" Father Madhava looked gravely at Rajesh. The betrayal shattered her soul. Now she wanders, whispering to those who venture too close. She wants vengeance, and she will not rest until the ritual is completed. That night, Rajesh could not shake off the feeling that something was watching him. The wind howled through the trees, making the shadows dance wildly across his room. His grandmother had fallen asleep early, but Rajesh stayed awake, pondering what Father Madhava had told him. A spirit? A vengeful priestess? The idea seemed absurd, but there was something in the priest's voice, a deep sense of dread, that made Rajesh feel uneasy. Unable to sleep, he decided to go for a walk, hoping the cold night air would clear his head. As he stepped outside, the village was shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The houses were mere silhouettes in the mist, their windows dark and empty. Rajesh walked down the narrow dirt road toward the forest's edge. He had heard the stories, of course, but like most city folk, he had always dismissed them as superstition. Now, however, as the chill in the air deepened and the fog closed in around him, he felt a strange pull toward the trees. The path through the forest was narrow, and the branches overhead intertwined, blocking out most of the moonlight. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the sound of the wind shifted, almost like a murmur, as if the forest itself was whispering his name. Rajesh! The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it sent a jolt through his body. He froze in place, straining his ears to catch the source of the sound. There was no one around, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. He must have imagined it, he thought. But then it came again, louder this time, almost as if it were right beside him. Rajesh! He turned quickly, his heart racing, but saw nothing in the darkness. He backed away slowly, feeling an overwhelming urge to turn and run. But then, through the fog, he saw it, the well. It stood there, at the heart of the forest, covered in vines and moss. Its stone walls were cracked and weathered, and the air around it seemed colder than anywhere else in the forest. Rajesh had heard stories of this place, the old well that no one dared approach after sunset. According to the villagers, it was here that the ancient ritual had been disrupted. His feet moved on their own as he walked closer to the well. There was an unsettling silence now, the whispers gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of his vision. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as the figure grew clearer, Rajesh's blood ran cold. A woman in tattered, white clothing stood by the well, her long black hair obscuring her face. Her skin was pale, almost deathly, and her hands were outstretched toward the well, as though beckoning him. Rajesh opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. The figure moved toward him, her steps gliding over the earth, as if she were floating. Her face slowly lifted, revealing hollow, empty eyes. Her lips curled into a twisted smile that sent a shiver of dread through his body. "You should not have come here," she whispered, her voice echoing in his mind. Rajesh stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to flee, but the figure's hand shot out and gripped his wrist with an unnatural strength. Her cold fingers seemed to burn through his skin, and a voice echoed in his ears, low and guttural. "You have disturbed my slumber, Rajesh. Now, you will help me finish what was started." He struggled to break free, but the woman's grip tightened, and the world around him began to spin. The fog thickened, and the trees seemed to close in, their branches twisting and reaching out like skeletal hands. The woman's voice became more frantic, filled with rage. "You will finish the ritual, or you will die like the others." Rajesh's mind raced, and in a moment of clarity, he remembered the words of Father Madhava. The ritual, the curse, Chandrika. He realized with horror that the woman before him was not just a spirit but the vengeful priestess herself. With a sudden burst of strength, Rajesh wrenched his arm free and sprinted back toward the village, the whispers growing louder and more urgent in his ears. The forest seemed to close in behind him, but he didn't dare look back. His legs burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop until he reached the safety of his grandmother's house. The following morning, Rajesh could barely sleep. His body was exhausted, but his mind was too troubled by what he had seen. He had to understand what was happening, what Chandrika wanted from him, and why the curse had been awakened. He found his grandmother in the small kitchen, quietly preparing breakfast. Her face was drawn, and she looked at him with a knowing expression, as though she had been expecting his return. "Rajesh," she said softly, without looking up. "You saw her, didn't you?" Rajesh nodded, his throat tight. She called me by name. She wanted me to finish the ritual." "But what ritual? What does she mean?" Nirmala set down the spoon she had been holding and turned to face him. Her eyes were sad, but there was also a deep, unspoken understanding in them. "It is the curse of our family, Rajesh," she said, her voice thick with sorrow. "Your great-grandfather was the one who, many years ago, broke the sacred ritual that kept Chandrika's spirit bound to the forest. He betrayed her trust, and in doing so, he doomed our family to carry her curse." Rajesh listened in stunned silence as his grandmother recounted the story of the ritual. Chandrika had once been a priestess who served the forest spirits, but when she fell in love with a man from the village, she was cast out. Desperate to prove her love, she had tried to use the ancient magic to bind her spirit to the land, but in doing so, she betrayed her sacred duty, and the magic backfired. The ritual was interrupted, and the spirits of the forest turned against her. She was left to wander, her soul fractured, cursed to seek vengeance on those who disturbed her domain. And now, Rajesh was the one chosen to complete what had been broken. "You must stop her, Rajesh," Nirmala said, her voice trembling. "But the ritual, it requires a great sacrifice." Before Rajesh could respond, a loud knock echoed through the door. His heart skipped a beat as he rushed to answer it, only to find Father Madhava standing on the doorstep, his face grim. "The time has come," he said, his voice grave. "We must finish what was started, but it will not be easy. If we do not, the forest will claim us all." Father Madhava's presence in the doorway seemed to fill the room with a chilling weight. Rajesh, still trying to process the night's events, stepped aside, allowing the priest to enter. The old man's eyes, usually full of calm wisdom, now held a grim determination. "We don't have much time," Father Madhava said, his voice low. "Chandrika's spirit grows restless. The longer we wait, the stronger her power will become. And if the ritual is not completed by dawn, she will consume this entire village and all who reside within it." Rajesh felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He couldn't fathom how something as ancient as this curse could have such power, but everything he had experienced that night, the whispering shadows, the vengeful spirit, left no room for doubt. The forest was alive and it was angry. "We have to go to the well," Father Madhava continued. "The ritual must be completed there, where it all began. But to do so, we must offer a sacrifice, one that will appease the spirits of the forest. A life given willingly to bind Chandrika's curse once and for all." Rajesh turned to his grandmother. The horror in her eyes mirrored his own fear. "What kind of sacrifice? How do we stop her?" Nirmala spoke quietly, her voice heavy with years of hidden pain. "The sacrifice must be one of blood, Rajesh. A life for a life. The blood of the one who broke the ritual long ago. The blood of our ancestors." Rajesh recoiled in shock. "You mean my blood? My life?" Father Madhava's face softened, but there was no compassion in his eyes. "The curse has been passed down through generations, cannot be undone without a sacrifice. And it is not just any blood, it is the blood of the descendant of the one who caused the betrayal. That is why she called your name. She knows you are the one who must finish what was started." Rajesh's heart pounded in his chest. He thought of his mother, who had died when he was young, and his father, who had never spoken of their family's past. Was this what they had meant when they talked about old family secrets? He had always dismissed them, thinking them to be exaggerated tales of a simpler time. But now, as the weight of his lineage pressed down on him, he realized there was no escape. "Then what must I do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Father Madhava nodded. "We must go to the well, and you must offer your blood to the spirits. Only then will Chandrika's spirit be bound, and her rage quelled. But you must be willing, Rajesh. If you hesitate, if you are not ready to give yourself to the forest, then the curse will consume you instead. The journey to the well was quiet, too quiet. The fog that had been thick the night before was now even denser, enveloping the forest in a ghostly haze. Rajesh walked between Father Madhava and his grandmother, the weight of their shared history pressing down on him with every step. The path seemed familiar yet foreign. The trees stretched higher now, their branches creaking and groaning in the still air. As they neared the heart of the forest, the whispers returned, swirling around them like a soft wind. Rajesh's skin prickled with the sensation that eyes were watching him from every direction. The darkness of the woods seemed to deepen, and the silence grew more oppressive. Finally, they reached the clearing. The well stood before them, now more ominous than ever. The stones around it were covered in thick vines, and the air grew unnaturally cold as they approached. Father Madhava stepped forward, raising his hands in a prayer to the spirits of the forest. He muttered incantations in a language that Rajesh couldn't understand, his voice blending with the whispers around them. The figure of Chandrika appeared once more, her ghostly form emerging from the fog as though summoned by the ritual. Her eyes glowed with a fiery intensity, and her once muted smile stretched into something darker, more malicious. "Why have you come?" she hissed, her voice an echo that rattled the very air around them. "You seek to bind me? To trap me here forever? You think your pathetic offerings will appease me?" Rajesh stood still, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath shallow. Father Madhava motioned for him to step forward. "Rajesh," the priest said, "it is time. You must offer yourself to the forest." Rajesh took a deep breath. He had no choice. He had to do this for the village, for his grandmother, and for himself. He stepped forward slowly, his feet heavy as though the forest itself was trying to keep him from moving. The ground beneath the well trembled as Chandrika's form grew more solid, her presence filling the clearing. She reached toward Rajesh, her cold fingers brushing against his skin. "You will give your life to me," she whispered, "or I will take it." Rajesh raised his hand, pressing it against the stones of the well. He closed his eyes, offering his blood willingly as the spirits demanded. As his palm bled, the air around them crackled with energy, and a powerful force gripped him, pulling him toward the well. "May your soul find peace," Father Madhava muttered, completing the final words of the ritual. For a brief moment, everything went still. The whispers ceased. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a final, terrifying scream, Chandrika's form shattered into the mist, her rage dissipating like smoke. The well groaned, its ancient stones shifting, as if the curse had finally been lifted. Rajesh collapsed to his knees, his blood soaking into the earth. The weight of the curse was gone, but he knew the cost had been high. His grandmother knelt beside him, tears in her eyes. "You did it, Rajesh. You ended it." Father Madhava stood silently, watching the clearing, ensuring that the spirit would not return. The morning after the ritual, the fog had lifted, and the sun rose over the village in a way that felt almost surreal. The once dark forest was now silent, and the weight of the curse seemed to have lifted from the land. The village of Gallipoli, once haunted by the whispers of the past, was now at peace. Rajesh sat by the fire with his grandmother, the two of them reflecting on what had transpired. The pain of the ritual was still fresh in his mind, but he knew that it had been necessary. The curse had been broken, and the village had been saved. As the sun set behind the hills, Rajesh looked out over the village. The wind was still and the air was calm. For the first time in many years, he felt as though he could breathe again. But even as the village returned to its quiet existence, Rajesh knew that the forest would always hold its secrets. The spirits that had once haunted the land were gone, but the memories of the whispering shadows of Andhra Pradesh would linger forever. Weeks passed, and life in Gallipoli slowly returned to normal. The villagers no longer spoke in hushed tones, and the once constant fear that had gripped the settlement seemed to fade into the past. Yet, for Rajesh, the memories of the forest, the well, and Chandrika were forever etched into his mind. He had done what was necessary, but the weight of the ritual, the sacrifice, and the terrible price of peace never quite left him. One evening, as he sat with his grandmother on the porch of their small house, the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and red, Rajesh found himself lost in thought. The air was still, but there was an unsettling quietness to it, as though something was waiting just beyond the edge of perception. Nirmala, her hands trembling as she sipped her tea, seemed to sense his unease. She had aged considerably since the ritual, her face more drawn, her eyes filled with a quiet sorrow that Rajesh hadn't seen before. "Grandmother," Rajesh asked softly, his voice uncertain, "do you think the curse is truly over? Do you think Chandrika is gone for good?" Nirmala's eyes widened, a flicker of fear flashing across her face before she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "The curse is gone, Rajesh. The spirits of the forest have been quiet, and the well is no longer a place of darkness. But some things, some forces, they don't truly disappear. They linger in the shadows, waiting for the right moment." Rajesh frowned. "But we did everything right, didn't we? The ritual, the sacrifice, we followed the priest's instructions. I gave everything. She was sealed." His grandmother nodded, but her gaze drifted to the distant trees. "You did what you had to do, Rajesh, but you must never forget the power of the past. It doesn't just vanish. Can't be erased no matter how much we wish it could. There are always echoes, always shadows." Rajesh's throat tightened as his grandmother's words settled in. He had hoped that, with Chandrika's departure, the haunting would end, that life would return to its simple, peaceful rhythm. But deep down, he knew that the shadows had not left entirely. That night, as Rajesh lay in bed, sleep eluded him. The air around him felt dense, heavy with a presence he couldn't name. It was almost as if the forest itself was watching, waiting for something. He tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. His mind kept drifting back to the well, the place where everything had begun and ended, the place where Chandrika had been bound. Had the ritual truly sealed her spirit? Or had they missed something? Suddenly, a faint whisper filled the room, soft but unmistakable. "Rajesh!" His heart skipped a beat. He sat up in bed, wide-eyed, his breath shallow. The whisper was not in his ears but in his mind. Urgent, insistent. "Rajesh, come back to me." It was Chandrika's voice, unmistakable. The very same voice that had haunted him in the forest. He could feel her presence again, a coldness creeping into the room, a shadow that loomed over him. "No!" he whispered, shaking his head as panic surged through him. "No, this can't be happening." The room seemed to grow darker, and the temperature dropped. The walls closed in, the shadows twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. He bolted from the bed, his body trembling, his mind racing. He had to get out. He had to leave the house. But as he stumbled toward the door, the whisper returned, louder this time, almost a scream in his ears. "Rajesh, you cannot escape me." He froze, terror flooding his body. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a roar, filling his mind, drowning out all rational thought. He turned to face the window, where the moonlight had begun to flicker, casting strange shadows across the room. And then, in the darkness, he saw her, Chandrika, standing in the center of the room, her pale, ghostly form shimmering like mist, her hollow eyes fixed on him, burning with unrelenting fury. "You are mine now, Rajesh. You promised to finish the ritual, and you did. But now, you must serve me forever." The air around him crackled, the energy of the forest overwhelming the small room. Rajesh backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. He had been so sure the curse was over, that Chandrika had been bound. But now, as her spirit materialized before him, he realized the truth. There was no escaping her. No escaping the legacy of his bloodline. Chandrika raised her hand, and the shadows in the room swirled around her like an endless storm. The room seemed to close in on Rajesh, and he felt the pull of the darkness. The whispers returned, louder now, as if the forest itself was calling to him. His grandmother's warning echoed in his mind. Some things never truly vanish. The curse had been broken, but the spirit's hunger for vengeance remained. And now Rajesh was trapped in its grasp. The next morning, the village of Gallipoli awoke to an eerie silence. The birds did not sing, and the air was still. Rajesh's house, once filled with the warmth of his grandmother's presence, now stood empty. No one had seen him leave, and no one knew where he had gone. In the center of the village, Father Madhava stood, staring toward the forest with an expression of deep concern. He had sensed something amiss. Something had been disturbed. The ritual had not been completed in the way it was meant to be. And now the consequences were becoming clear. It wasn't over. The curse had not been fully lifted. Father Madhava turned back toward the village, knowing that there would be no peace until the forest's final secret was revealed, until the last piece of the puzzle was set into place. The years passed and life in Gallipoli moved on. But there were whispers of a young man who had once tried to escape the past, only to be consumed by it. The villagers told stories of Rajesh, of the night he disappeared into the forest, never to be seen again. Some believed he had become part of the forest itself, a spirit trapped between worlds, waiting for another to carry on the ritual. And then, one cold January night, a stranger came to the village, a young man with eyes like the mist. His face was familiar, yet twisted with something dark. He walked the narrow streets, heading toward the old well, as the whispers of the forest followed him. Some say he still walks there, seeking the final part of the curse. Others claim that he is Chandrika's new servant, destined to carry on the legacy of betrayal and vengeance. But one thing was certain: the forest never truly forgets, and neither does the curse. Story 4. The Curse of the Chilkaru Hills. It was the beginning of January when the cold winds of the Chilkaru Hills swept through the village of Veerapampeta. The early mornings in the village were always foggy, with the dense mist clinging to the ground, making the roads eerily quiet. The villagers, though accustomed to the fog and the chilly air, couldn't shake off the strange feeling that something was off that year. This particular January, the fog seemed heavier than usual, the silence deeper, as if the land itself was holding its breath. It was during this oppressive winter that a stranger arrived in Veerapampeta. His name was Prakash, a city man from Hyderabad who had come to the village for a short break. Prakash had heard tales of the infamous Chilkaru Hills and the legends surrounding them. Stories of ancient spirits, lost souls, and the supernatural forces that haunted the dense forests atop the hills were well known throughout the region. Most locals avoided the area, too fearful to venture near, but Prakash, intrigued by the tales, was determined to explore it. The villagers, however, were not so welcoming. They had seen outsiders come and go, some returning with their lives, others with their minds broken, or worse, never returning at all. It was the oldest resident of the village, Amaji, who tried to warn him. With her sunken eyes and hands gnarled from age, she took Prakash aside one evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills. "You don't know what you're asking for," she said, her voice a raspy whisper. "The Chilkaru Hills are cursed. The spirits there are not like other spirits. They don't just haunt, they possess. They wait for souls to wander too close, and once you're within their grasp, there's no escape." Prakash smiled politely, though he couldn't dismiss the unease in Amaji's voice. "I'm just here for a few days. I won't go too far into the hills. Just a quick visit to see the sights." "Beware, young man," Amaji warned, clutching his arm tightly. "Don't say I didn't warn you." Ignoring her advice, Prakash set off the next morning, excited by the thought of unraveling a story that had intrigued him for so long. As he walked out of the village and toward the Chilkaru Hills, he could feel the weight of the fog growing thicker, the chill in the air sharper. The road leading to the base of the hills was narrow and winding, flanked by tall, skeletal trees that looked like twisted sentinels. The village behind him faded into the mist, and Prakash soon found himself alone, standing at the foot of the hills. The tall, jagged peaks loomed ominously in the distance, their summits lost in the clouds. It was an unnerving sight, but one that Prakash couldn't resist. He tightened his backpack and began the climb. The further Prakash climbed, the stranger the atmosphere became. The fog rolled in thicker, almost suffocating, and the wind picked up, carrying whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. He paused for a moment, looking back at the village he had just left behind. There was nothing now but an endless expanse of fog and mist, as though the world beyond the hills had disappeared entirely. With a deep breath, Prakash pressed on. As he ascended the steep path, the trees around him seemed to grow more twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, hidden in the shadows. Hours passed, and the climb began to take its toll. Prakash stopped to rest, sitting on a boulder near a small clearing. He pulled out his water bottle, taking a swig before wiping his brow. The air was damp and cold, and despite his physical exhaustion, he felt an unsettling sense of being trapped, almost as if the forest had closed in around him, trapping him in its grip. Suddenly, he heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the dried leaves behind him. Prakash's heart raced. He spun around, but there was no one there. He stood, his muscles tense, and scanned the clearing. There was nothing, no sign of life, no animals, no people, just the sound of the wind whistling through the branches. "Hello?" he called out hesitantly, but there was no answer, just the eerie silence of the forest. Thinking it was his imagination playing tricks on him, Prakash turned back to continue his hike. But the moment he took a step forward, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, pale and ghostly, was standing among the trees. The figure was draped in tattered clothing, its long, matted hair covering its face. It stood motionless, staring at Prakash with hollow, empty eyes. The air around it seemed to shimmer with a strange, unnatural energy, and the temperature dropped even further, sending a chill straight to his bones. Before Prakash could react, the figure disappeared into the mist, vanishing without a trace. The strange figure haunted Prakash's mind as he continued his journey up the hills. He tried to convince himself that it had been a trick of the light, but deep down, he knew that something was wrong. The fog seemed to grow thicker the further he went, and he began to lose track of time. The sun was hidden behind layers of clouds, casting the world in an eternal twilight. Every turn in the path felt like it led him deeper into an unknown world, a world that seemed to be suffocating under a dark, heavy weight. Eventually, Prakash reached the summit of the hills. There, hidden in the heart of the dense trees, was an ancient temple. It was a crumbling structure, its stone walls overgrown with moss and vines. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and an ominous energy radiated from the temple itself. It felt as though the very earth around it was alive with the spirits that had once inhabited it, alive with a dark force that had not yet let go. Prakash approached the temple cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He stepped through the broken archway, the eerie silence pressing in around him. Inside, the temple was devoid of any statues or idols. There were only old stone altars covered in dust, their surfaces cracked and weathered by centuries of neglect. At the far end of the temple, Prakash noticed something that made his blood run cold. A stone slab, carved with strange symbols, a dark red stain in the center. He knew instantly what it was. This was where the rituals had been performed, the ancient sacrifices made to appease the spirits of the hills. But as Prakash stepped closer to the slab, a voice echoed in his mind, warning him. "Leave now." The voice was soft, but unmistakable. He turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The voice had come from within, but it felt as though it had come from the very walls themselves. Fear gripped him as he realized that the forest, the hills, the temple, all of it was alive and it was watching him. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the temple, extinguishing the faint light that had come through the cracks in the stone. The doors slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping him inside. Prakash tried to find his way out, but the walls seemed to shift, changing the path. The temple was alive with whispers, the voices growing louder. He could hear them now, the voices of the dead, the ones who had been sacrificed, their wails filled with torment and sorrow. They were never meant to leave, one voice whispered. And neither will you. Prakash's panic rose as he stumbled through the temple, unable to find the exit. His mind raced with questions, but the answers eluded him. The fog outside was no longer an inconvenience. It was part of the curse, a barrier keeping him trapped in the temple's grip. The whispers turned into howls, and the walls seemed to close in on him. The spirits had awoken, and they would not let him leave. Prakash's legs trembled beneath him. His mind screamed for him to run, but every instinct told him that running would only make it worse. The deeper he went into the temple, the closer he got to the source of the curse, a force ancient, malevolent, and hungering for the souls of the living. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. Prakash's breath was shallow, his every sense heightened, straining to detect the slightest sound, the smallest movement. And then, as if the very air itself was drawing in a long, painful breath, the walls began to tremble. The stone slab at the center of the room cracked, its surface shifting as if something underneath was awakening. Prakash stumbled back, his heart racing. A low, rumbling growl echoed from the depths of the temple, shaking the ground beneath his feet. The stone slab shifted violently, and from the darkness below, something began to emerge. It was a figure, a shadowy, twisted form, its limbs elongated and spindly, its face obscured by a veil of tattered cloth. It moved with unnatural speed, its form flickering like a flame in the wind, and Prakash could feel the very ground beneath him shake with its presence. The figure spoke, its voice a guttural hiss that seemed to come from every direction at once. "You dare to seek answers, mortal? You dare to disturb the ancient covenant." The words were like a knife to his heart, filled with malice and contempt. Prakash could barely comprehend what was happening, his mind spinning in a vortex of confusion and terror. But before he could react, the figure lunged forward, its hands outstretched toward him. He was frozen in place, unable to move as the figure drew closer. Its form shimmered in the dim light, its face now visible, a grotesque mask of death and despair, its eyes empty voids that seemed to suck the light out of the room. As it reached for him, Prakash felt a cold, oppressive pressure settle on his chest, as though the very air had turned to lead. In an instant, the figure was upon him, its hands grabbing at his neck, squeezing with a supernatural strength. Prakash gasped for air, his hands clawing at the figure's grip, but it was like trying to push against a mountain. He was being consumed, drawn into the darkness of the curse itself. But then, something changed. A bright flash of light, blinding, almost divine, filled the temple, casting the shadowy figure into retreat. The figure hissed in agony, recoiling from the light, its form flickering and warping. For a moment, it seemed as though the very walls of the temple were tearing themselves apart, as if the building itself was rejecting the entity. The figure screamed in rage, its voice shrill and piercing. "You are not meant to be here. You do not belong." And with that, it vanished into the shadows, leaving only the sound of its retreating hiss echoing in the temple's silence. Prakash, gasping for air, stumbled backward, his body shaking violently. The light from the strange force still lingered in the temple, casting long shadows against the cracked stone walls. It was as if something had intervened, something powerful enough to banish the evil that resided within the temple. But even as the last remnants of the light faded, Prakash knew that the curse had not been broken. It had only been momentarily delayed. His mind raced with the realization. He had uncovered something far darker than he had ever imagined. This was not just a simple curse. It was a pact made long ago, a ritual bound by blood and death, and it demanded a price. The spirits of the Chilkaru Hills were not just restless. They were the product of a pact that had allowed the land to thrive at the cost of countless lives. But who had made this pact, and why? The moments of silence felt like hours. Prakash's heart still thundered in his chest as he tried to regain his composure. His fingers trembled as he wiped sweat from his brow, his breath ragged and uneven. His mind spun with questions that had no easy answers. He had ventured into the Chilkaru Hills to satisfy his curiosity, but now He was part of something far larger and more terrifying than he could have imagined. As the air settled, the oppressive feeling of dread lifted slightly, but the temple still felt alive with an ominous presence. The whispers had returned, faint but persistent, as if the spirits were calling to him from the depths of the darkness. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the far end of the temple. It was an old man, hunched over with age, his long, flowing beard and tattered robes giving him the appearance of a forgotten hermit. He walked slowly with a staff in hand, his eyes gleaming with a strange light. Prakash didn't know whether to feel relief or fear. "Who are you?" Prakash asked, his voice shaky, but firm. "What is this place?" The old man stopped in front of him, his gaze piercing and wise. "This is the Temple of the Lost," he said in a voice that seemed to echo with centuries of wisdom. "A place where the souls of the damned are kept, a place where the dead can never rest. I am the guardian of this temple, and I have watched over it for countless years." Prakash's mind raced. You're the one who stopped that thing, that creature?" The old man nodded slowly. "I did not stop it. I only delayed its return. It is bound to this place, as am I. We all are. The curse of the Chilkaru Hills has been passed down through generations, bound by an ancient ritual." "What is this ritual? Why are the spirits so angry?" "The ritual was made in desperation," the old man explained, his voice quiet but filled with sorrow. "Centuries ago, the people of this land were dying from famine and disease. They turned to the spirits of the hills, offering a sacrifice to save themselves. But the price they paid was too great. They promised the spirits their souls, and ever since, the spirits have claimed those who wander too close. The curse was born from their greed, their desire for power. And now, the spirits are forever bound to the hills, never to be free." "But how do I get out of here?" Prakash asked, his voice filled with panic. The old man's gaze softened. "You have already entered the heart of the curse, young one. There is no easy way out. The only way to escape is to break the ritual, to sever the bond between the living and the dead." "But how do I do that?" The guardian looked into Prakash's eyes, his gaze filled with an understanding that chilled him to the bone. "To break the ritual, you must confront the entity that binds it all, the one who controls the spirits. You must find the heart of the curse and destroy it." Prakash's throat went dry as the old man's words echoed in his mind. It was not just a matter of survival anymore. It was a battle for the very soul of the land. The old man's words haunted Prakash as he wandered through the temple, his mind racing with the gravity of what had been said. The guardian had offered him a path to freedom, but it was no simple task. The spirits of the Chilkaru Hills were not mere ghosts. They were trapped by an ancient ritual, one that had given birth to the curse that plagued the land. To break the curse, Prakash would have to confront the very entity that controlled them, the one who had made the original pact, the one who still fed on the souls of the living. The old man's presence was a comfort, but Prakash knew that the time for comfort had passed. The guardian's role was that of a protector, but he was also a prisoner, bound to the temple as much as the spirits were bound to the hills. He could not fight the entity. That responsibility, Prakash realized, fell to him. "I need to know more," Prakash said, his voice firm, despite the fear gnawing at him. "Where do I find this heart of the curse?" The old man nodded slowly. "You will find it deep within the heart of the hills, beyond the temple. There is a cave hidden beneath the roots of the oldest tree in the forest. It is there that the ritual was first performed, and it is there that the heart of the curse still beats." The old man handed Prakash a small, worn talisman, a dark stone shaped like an eye. "This will protect you from the spirits that guard the cave. But be warned, the entity that controls them is not so easily vanquished. You will face a darkness far greater than any spirit you've encountered." Prakash took the talisman, feeling the weight of the responsibility settling upon him. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes." With that, the guardian turned and began walking toward the exit of the temple, his form disappearing into the shadows. Prakash stood alone in the eerie stillness, the weight of his task pressing down on him like an invisible force. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the temple doors, ready to face whatever lay beyond. The fog outside had thickened since he had entered the temple, but Prakash wasn't deterred. The old man's words rang in his mind as he made his way through the dense forest toward the oldest tree. The path was treacherous, winding through gnarled roots and twisted vines. The forest seemed to shift around him, its shadows growing longer, the air heavier. The spirits were close, watching him, waiting for him to falter. As he ventured deeper into the forest, Prakash could feel the temperature drop further. His breath came out in visible clouds, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He could hear the whispers again, but this time they were different. More insistent, more malicious. "You cannot escape," they hissed. "You belong to us now." Prakash clenched his fists and pressed on, his mind focused on the task at hand. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of walking, he reached the clearing where the ancient tree stood. Its massive roots twisted and coiled around the earth like serpents, its bark gnarled and scarred with age. It was like no tree he had ever seen before, alive with an unnatural energy, pulsating with dark power. At the base of the tree, Prakash saw it, a narrow passageway partially concealed by the thick roots. He took a deep breath, feeling the talisman growing warmer in his hand, and entered the passage. The cave was damp and cold, the air thick with the stench of decay. The walls were slick with moisture, and the path ahead was steep and treacherous. He stumbled forward, his heart racing, as the whispers grew louder. But he could not turn back now. The heart of the curse was near. As he rounded a bend in the cave, he saw it. A glowing, pulsating orb of dark energy floating at the center of the chamber. It was the heart of the curse, the source of the darkness that had plagued the Chilkaru Hills for centuries. The orb radiated a sickly light, its surface rippling with energy. The air around it was thick with malevolent power, and Prakash could feel his skin crawl as he stepped closer. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was the entity, the one who had made the pact so many centuries ago. Its form was impossible to comprehend, a shifting mass of darkness and light, with eyes that burned like twin suns. It spoke, its voice deep and thunderous, echoing through the cave. "You should not have come," it said. "The pact is eternal. No one escapes the price of the blood sacrificed to me." Prakash took a deep breath and stepped forward, his voice steady. "I will break the pact." The entity laughed, a sound that reverberated through the very stone of the cave. "You think you can defeat me, mortal? You are nothing but a fleeting moment in time, and I am eternal. The curse is mine, and it will never be broken." Prakash raised the talisman, its dark stone glowing with an eerie light. "I won't let you continue to torment these people." With a cry, he hurled the talisman toward the orb. As it flew through the air, the cave seemed to tremble, the very ground shaking beneath him. The entity screeched in fury, but it was too late. The talisman struck the orb, and in a burst of blinding light, the curse shattered. The cave collapsed around him, the ground crumbling and falling away as the entity screamed in agony. The air grew heavy with a final, deafening roar, and then, suddenly, everything was silent. Prakash awoke to the soft glow of dawn breaking through the fog. His body ached, and his mind was foggy from the ordeal, but he was alive. The cave had collapsed, but he had somehow escaped. Through sheer will or fate, he did not know. The curse had been broken, and the spirits that had once haunted the hills were now free, their souls finally at rest. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and made his way back to the village. The path was clear now, the fog lighter, as if the land itself had been cleansed. The forest no longer felt oppressive, and the air was fresher than it had been since he arrived. The heavy weight of darkness that had clung to the Chilkaru Hills had lifted. When Prakash returned to Virapampeta, he was greeted with quiet gratitude. The villagers had sensed the change, though they did not know the full extent of what had transpired. They had heard the stories, the rumors of the curse being broken, but they would never know the true depth of the horror Prakash had faced. But Prakash knew. He knew that he had confronted something far beyond his understanding, something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He had faced the heart of the curse and survived. But the memories of the dark entity, of the horrors he had witnessed, would never fade. And as the sun set over the Chilkaru hills, Prakash felt the weight of his actions settle on his shoulders. The curse had been broken, but the land would never forget what had happened. The spirits were free, but their stories would live on, whispered through the fog, echoing across the hills. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the Chilkaru hills, the darkness still stirred, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to disturb its slumber. Story 5. The Forest of Forgotten Shadows. In the remote hill stations of Andhra Pradesh, nestled between dense forests and towering peaks, there existed a village known as Chilkalaripet. The village was not on the main map and had no tourist attractions. It was surrounded by thick forest, which, locals often claimed, concealed something dark, something the world had long forgotten. The villagers spoke little to outsiders, but when they did, it was always with a shadow in their eyes, as though their words could awaken something ancient. The year had barely begun. It was the bitter month of January, a time when the forest, like a slumbering beast, was wrapped in an unyielding silence. The cold air was biting, and the mist that rolled down from the hills had an unsettling quality to it. The villagers avoided the forest during these months, claiming that spirits roamed the woods and that the trees themselves whispered of untold horrors. But for Raghav, a young man from the city, these tales were nothing more than superstition. He had come to Chilkalaripet seeking solitude. A writer by profession, Raghav was looking for inspiration for his next book. The chaos of city life had worn him down, and he needed a break, some time to himself. The village was quiet, serene, and ideal for his retreat. Raghav had arrived on the last day of December, greeted by an unusually thick fog that veiled the village. The elderly villagers warned him not to stray too far from the town during the days of January, but he paid them little attention. They had given him a room in a dilapidated guest house, an old building that smelled faintly of mildew and earth. It was far from luxurious, but it suited his needs. And, most importantly, it was away from the bustle of modern life. The first night in the village, Raghav had trouble sleeping. The cold seeped into his bones, and the wind howled outside, brushing the old wooden windows with a ghostly touch. But it was the silence of the night that disturbed him the most. There were no sounds of insects, no night birds, and no rustling of leaves. It was as though the entire world had fallen into a deep, oppressive sleep. As Raghav lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he heard something, a faint, rhythmic tapping on the door. It was soft at first, almost like the sound of a branch brushing against the wood, but it persisted, growing louder. It was an unnerving sound, one that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He sat up, unsure whether he had imagined it. Cautiously, he opened the door to find nothing, only the dense fog outside, swirling in the moonlight. The chill in the air intensified, but there was no sign of anyone. He stepped out onto the narrow porch and looked around, but the village was eerily quiet. A sense of unease washed over him, but he dismissed it as his imagination running wild. The next day, Raghav took a walk through the village, hoping to clear his mind. As he passed the local temple, an old woman who sat near the entrance stopped him. Her face was lined with age, and her eyes gleamed with an unsettling knowledge. "You shouldn't be here, young man," she said in a cracked voice, her words like an ancient warning. Raghav stopped and smiled politely, thinking it was just another superstition. "I'm just here for some peace and quiet," he replied. The old woman's gaze hardened. "The forest doesn't like outsiders. You should leave before the fog thickens again. In January, it wakes up, and it remembers." Raghav laughed it off, but the woman's words lingered in his mind. He continued on his walk, passing the thick woods that bordered the village. The forest seemed to stare back at him with its towering trees and dense underbrush. He was told by some of the villagers that the woods were haunted, that there were spirits who had once lived there, people who had vanished into the shadows of the trees. As the day wore on, Raghav found himself at the edge of the forest, looking at an old, forgotten shrine. It was small, built of weathered stone, and barely visible under the thick vines that overtook its structure. The shrine seemed out of place, standing in the midst of the trees, as though it were a remnant of another time. Curiosity tugged at him, and he stepped closer, drawn to it by an unknown force. The shrine was unlike any Raghav had ever seen. Its worn stone walls were covered in moss, and the carvings that once depicted divine figures were now eroded beyond recognition. Yet, there was an unsettling energy about the place, as though the shrine was holding something back, something ancient and powerful. Raghav stepped closer, brushing the leaves aside. He could almost hear a faint humming sound, a melody that seemed to come from the very stones themselves. The air felt colder as he approached, and for a moment, he wondered whether he should turn back. But his curiosity got the better of him. The shrine was small, with a low entrance that seemed to beckon him inside. He ducked under the stone arch and found himself in a dimly lit space. The walls inside were adorned with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't quite explain. A single oil lamp flickered in the corner, casting long shadows on the walls. Raghav stepped further inside, his flashlight illuminating the room. In the center, there was a stone pedestal with what appeared to be an idol of a deity. Its face half eroded, its eyes hollow. The air inside the shrine was thick, almost suffocating, and Raghav could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him. He reached out and gently touched the idol. The moment his fingers made contact, he felt a jolt, like a shock running through his body. The air seemed to shift around him, and the temperature dropped even further. The humming sound grew louder, and Raghav's heart began to race. Suddenly, the oil lamp flickered and went out, plunging the shrine into darkness. Raghav froze, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He could hear something moving in the darkness. He wasn't alone. He turned to leave, but the entrance to the shrine had vanished. The door, which had once been visible, was now completely obscured by thick vines and shadows. The air grew colder still, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble. Panic set in. He turned in circles, trying to find an escape, but the shrine seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in. The humming noise had become a full-blown chant, a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that filled the space. He stumbled backward, crashing into the stone pedestal, knocking the idol off its base. The moment it hit the ground, the shrine seemed to come alive. The walls pulsed with dark energy, and the shadows in the corners of the room swirled. A low voice whispered in his ear, a language he couldn't understand, but it was filled with a deep, ancient hunger. The voice was coming from all directions, and it seemed to reach into his very soul. Raghav screamed and tried to back away, but the shadows surrounded him. He could feel his body growing cold, his breath shallow, and the air growing thick with an oppressive weight. The voice became louder, almost deafening, as though it were calling him to stay, calling him to complete something. And then, in the darkness, he saw it. A figure, tall and cloaked in shadow, stepped forward from the depths of the shrine. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Raghav tried to scream, but no sound came from his throat. The figure raised its hand, and Raghav felt his body freeze in place, unable to move, unable to speak. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice rumbled from the shadow. "You've awakened the curse of this place. Now you must pay the price." Raghav's breath was shallow, his chest tight with panic, but his body refused to move. The shadowy figure in front of him loomed larger, its glowing eyes the only thing visible in the dark. The voice that had whispered from all directions now emanated from the figure itself, a deep, guttural tone that sent chills down Raghav's spine. "You have disturbed something that was never meant to be disturbed," it said, each word vibrating in the air like a distant drumbeat. "Now the price must be paid." Raghav's mind raced. He had heard the village's warnings about the forest, the shrine, and the spirits that lived within. But he had dismissed it all as superstition, as the ramblings of old, frightened villagers. Now, standing in the heart of the shrine, facing something he couldn't comprehend, Raghav felt a deep, overwhelming sense of regret. The words of the old woman, the warning of the villagers, all of it flooded back to him, But it was too late. The figure raised its hand again, and the shadows around him deepened. They seemed to reach for him, curling around his legs like tendrils of dark smoke. Raghav struggled against the invisible grip, but it was no use. The darkness pressed closer, suffocating him, until his thoughts began to blur. But in that moment of terror, something strange happened. A voice, clear, human, and faintly familiar, cut through the darkness. It was soft at first, a whisper in the storm of fear and shadows. "Raghav, you must not stay." The voice was a woman's, and it sounded like it was coming from far away, but unmistakably real. Raghav's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know who it was, but it sounded as if the voice was trying to guide him, pull him out of the nightmare that had consumed him. He fought against the dark tendrils, forcing his legs to move, his body to react. The shadows around him screamed in anger, but the voice was louder now, pushing him forward. Raghav had no choice but to trust the voice. Desperate, he stumbled forward, his hands brushing against the cold stone walls, guiding him through the maze-like interior of the shrine. The darkness around him was thick, like a living thing, but the voice was steady, unwavering, and it led him through the winding corridors of the shrine. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw a faint sliver of light in the distance. Hope flared in his chest as he made his way toward it. The shadows clawed at his heels, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. With a final rush, Raghav burst through the last narrow passage and into the open air. The fog had thickened since he entered the shrine, but he could now see the moon, pale and distant, hanging in the sky like a watcher from another world. The voice spoke again, softer now, but still present. "Get out, now. The shrine will consume you." Raghav's pulse pounded in his ears. With a final surge of strength, he broke free of the shadow's grip and turned, running blindly toward the place where the door had once been. But when he reached it, he found no escape. The walls of the shrine had shifted. They had changed. It was as if the entire structure was alive, its stones groaning and shifting like the body of some ancient beast. Panicking, he spun around, looking for another way out. The figure, the shadow, was gone. Yet, its presence lingered, suffusing the room with a malevolent energy that made Raghav's skin crawl. And the voice, the woman's voice, continued to guide him. "Follow my voice. Do not look back. You are safe for now." Raghav looked around, his mind reeling. He was back in the forest, standing outside the shrine. But the feeling of dread was far from gone. The air still seemed heavy, oppressive, as though something was watching him from the darkness. The forest around him whispered, the trees swaying in rhythm with an unseen breeze. Raghav took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He needed to leave to get as far away from the shrine as possible. But as he turned to go, a movement in the corner of his vision caught his eye. The figure, its glowing eyes, was standing at the edge of the forest, watching him. Before he could react, the ground beneath him trembled, and a low, rumbling growl echoed through the trees. "Not all who enter the forest leave unscathed," the voice said, the woman's tone now tinged with sadness. "You have broken the seal, Raghav, and the forest remembers." The voice fell silent, but the darkness was far from gone. Raghav's blood ran cold as the growl reverberated through the trees, the very ground beneath his feet seeming to vibrate with ancient power. The glowing eyes of the shadowed figure remained fixed on him, and now he understood. The forest was not just a physical place. It was a living entity, a being that had been bound by the shrine for centuries. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. He had been chosen, unwillingly, to fulfill a terrible fate. Raghav turned to flee, his legs moving before his mind could catch up. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled through the thick underbrush, branches whipping at his face. The fog seemed to follow him, closing in like a noose. The once quiet forest was now alive with sounds. Creaking trees, distant whispers, and something else, something darker, closer. As he ran, he heard the voice again. "You must break the curse, Raghav. The ritual must be completed." The voice was no longer a guide, it was a command. But Raghav had no idea what the ritual was or how he could stop the curse that was now following him. He had no choice but to return to the shrine. His legs screamed in protest as he turned back toward the place that had nearly consumed him. But the pull of the curse, the unseen force, was too strong. His mind screamed in denial, but his body obeyed, dragging him back toward the shrine with an unrelenting force. By the time he reached the shrine again, the fog had become thick, almost blinding. The shrine seemed to loom in front of him, its stone walls now pulsing with an eerie glow. The shadows around it had deepened, swirling like a vortex, pulling everything around it into its grasp. Raghav hesitated at the entrance, dread pooling in his stomach. He didn't want to go back inside, didn't want to face whatever lay waiting for him. But he knew he had no choice. The voice was inside his head now, louder and clearer. "Do not resist, Raghav. You must free yourself." Raghav swallowed hard and entered the shrine once again. The air inside was thick with a heavy, oppressive force. The carvings on the walls seemed to move, shifting and contorting in ways that defied logic. The stone pedestal where the idol had been was now bare, as though the idol itself had never existed. In its place was a shallow stone basin, its surface covered with dark, congealed blood. The voice spoke again, now accompanied by an image in Raghav's mind. The ritual, the ancient binding ceremony that had been performed centuries ago, to keep the spirit of the forest in check, to seal it away. The ceremony had failed, and now the forest sought revenge. "You must complete what was left undone," the voice urged. "Offer yourself to the forest, and the curse will be lifted." Raghav's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know if he had the strength to follow through, but there was no other way. The forest would never let him leave unless the ritual was completed. With trembling hands, Raghav approached the stone basin. The air around him hummed, the shadows closing in tighter, suffocating him. The voice in his mind became a roar. The price must be paid. Raghav stood frozen before the stone basin, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice, now a cacophony of whispers and growls in his mind, urged him on. He felt the oppressive weight of the curse pressing against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. "The offering," the voice repeated. "The ritual must be completed." Raghav's mind raced. What could the offering be? He had no idea what was expected of him, but the shadows were closing in, and the chill in the air had become unbearable. The darkness felt alive, as if it were reaching out to claim him. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The forest was alive with its curse, and it would not let him leave. He glanced at the stone basin, its surface slick with dark, dried blood. The sight of it made him sick, and the scent in the air, the coppery tang of blood mixed with the earthy stench of decay, made him gag. But he could feel it, that pull, that undeniable urge to follow through, to finish what had been started centuries ago. "Do not resist," the voice commanded, its tone now a cold, calculating whisper. "The forest will be free again. You will be free." Raghav's legs felt weak as he knelt before the basin. The shadows seemed to swirl around him, their tendrils creeping closer, like hungry serpents. The air was thick with malevolent energy, and the weight of the curse pressed down on him, suffocating him. But he couldn't stop now. He had to complete the ritual. The voice in his mind guided him, urging him to place his hands into the basin. The blood inside shimmered faintly, like something alive, something that knew he was there. He recoiled at the thought of touching it, but he felt his body move as if controlled by some unseen force. His hands hovered over the basin, trembling. "The offering," the voice whispered again, the words echoing in his ears. "You must give of yourself." Raghav didn't understand what the voice meant. He didn't want to understand, but the force pulling him forward was too great. With a final, reluctant breath, he plunged his hands into the blood. The instant his skin touched the dark liquid, the world around him seemed to change. The shadows in the room twisted violently, and the temperature plummeted. The air grew thick, oppressive, like it was filled with something ancient and malevolent. The whispers grew louder, turning into a deafening chorus of voices, each one chanting in a language he couldn't comprehend. His body convulsed, and pain shot through him like 1,000 needles. His vision blurred, and the shadows seemed to engulf him, wrapping around him like chains. He tried to pull his hands out of the basin, but they were stuck, as if the blood had turned to stone, holding him captive. "Offer your soul to the forest," the voice commanded. "Give yourself to it, and the curse will end." Raghav's mind screamed in horror. He didn't want to die. He didn't want to be part of this twisted ritual. He tried to pull away again, but the shadows were too strong. They dragged him forward, pulling him deeper into the basin, as if trying to consume him whole. The whispers surrounded him, maddening in their intensity. They were everywhere, in his mind, in his ears, in his bones. The pain intensified, and Raghav thought he would be torn apart. His vision flickered, and for a moment he saw the forest, the great sprawling woods of Chilkalaripet. But the trees were not as they seemed. They twisted and writhed, their roots reaching into the earth like monstrous hands. And then, through the chaos, a figure appeared. It was the same shadowed figure he had seen in the forest, the one with glowing eyes. But now it was more than just an apparition. It was real. The figure stepped into his vision, its form taller and more imposing than before. Its eyes burned like twin embers, and its voice was no longer distant, but right beside him, booming in his mind. "You have completed the ritual," it said, its voice filled with both malice and triumph. "The forest will be free once more." Raghav's breath caught in his throat. He could feel it now, the power of the forest. It was ancient, overwhelming, and hungry. He was the offering, the one who had awakened it from its slumber. He had broken the seal, and now there was no going back. But then, as if in answer to his despair, a new voice cut through the darkness. It was faint at first, but it grew louder and stronger, pushing through the shadows. "Raghav!" It was the woman's voice, the same voice that had guided him out of the shrine earlier. He recognized it now, and with a surge of hope, he clung to it, willing himself to listen. "Raghav, do not give in." The figure in front of him, the shadowed entity, roared in fury. But the woman's voice, clear and unyielding, persisted. "Remember, the forest is not just evil. It is a part of this land. It needs balance, not destruction. You can still stop it." Raghav's body trembled as he fought against the force pulling him deeper into the basin. The blood clung to his skin like poison, but the voice of the woman, it was like a lifeline. He focused on it, blocking out everything else, pushing through the pain, the shadows, and the fear. "Tell me how," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the forest. "Destroy the idol. The idol is the key. Break it, and you will break the curse." Raghav's eyes widened. The idol, the one that had been in the shrine. He remembered its hollow eyes, the energy that radiated from it. If he could destroy it, he could end the curse, free himself, and release the forest from its ancient bondage. With all the strength he could muster, Raghav pulled his hands out of the basin. The blood resisted, but he tore free, stumbling back to his feet. The figure in front of him howled in rage, but he ignored it, his focus fixed on the idol. The shadows writhed around him, but he ran. His legs burned, his heart pounded in his chest, but he knew he had to act fast. The woman's voice echoed in his mind, urging him forward. "Destroy the idol. The curse ends with it." He reached the pedestal, and his eyes locked onto the idol. It was still there, standing ominously. The air around it hummed with dark energy, but Raghav didn't hesitate. He grabbed the idol with both hands, and for the first time, he felt its true power. A deep, ancient energy that wanted to consume him. But he didn't stop. With a primal scream, he threw the idol to the ground. The moment it shattered, the world seemed to explode. The ground trembled beneath Raghav's feet, and the air filled with a deafening roar. The shadows around him seemed to unravel, twisting and shrieking in agony. The curse, the forest's ancient hold on this land, was breaking apart. The sky above him split open, and the moonlight pierced through the fog like a spear, bathing the shrine in a harsh, cold light. The shadows retreated, dissolving into the night. But the woman's voice, clear, calm, and filled with relief, spoke again. "You did it, Raghav. The curse is broken." Raghav staggered back, his body weak and shaking. The pain in his chest was unbearable, but he could feel the weight lifting, the darkness receding. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, as the last remnants of the curse faded into the wind. The forest was silent now, its ominous presence gone. The fog lifted, and the trees, once twisted and malicious, now seemed to stand tall and proud in the moonlight. The air was crisp, clean, and filled with the quiet hum of life. But Raghav knew this would not be the end of his story. The forest had been freed, but it had not forgotten. It was watching him still, and the memory of what had happened would never fade. As he stumbled out of the shrine and into the now peaceful forest, he felt a strange sense of closure. He had completed the ritual, he had freed the land, but at what cost? The forest would always be there, in the shadows, waiting. The only thing Raghav could do now was leave, and never look back. Not all forests are silent, and not all shadows are harmless. Andhra Pradesh's haunted forests carry secrets older than the trees themselves, secrets of restless spirits, unbroken curses, and the fragile boundary between the living and the dead. As you step out of this journey into the darkness, remember this. Every rustling leaf, every flickering shadow, and every faint whisper might be more than meets the eye. These forests, steeped in eerie legends, seem to come alive in the quiet chill of January nights. Shadow's Lair is your gateway to such chilling mysteries, where every story leaves a fragment of the unknown lingering with you. Dare to explore these forests, but beware. The shadows watch, they remember, and sometimes they follow. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and stay in the light. Welcome to Shadow's Lair, where the darkness awaits.